wasn't good enough to sit around the breakfast table, as some of my family members like to do, and just complain and see issues as devastatingly oppressive, and the end of the world was coming. That kind of thinking never appealed to me. I always felt this is where I stood apart, I think, from my family. I always felt that it was not good enough to just sit and talk. You had to take some action. If you felt that there was a problem in the world, you needed to go out and do something about it. I don't think corruption really is that natural.
Okay.
Um, yeah, because I do think that there's plenty of evidence of societies, including um, Indigenous societies in Australia, where corruption didn't simply appear. Now, if it was a natural instinct corruption, you would expect it to appear in every society, and
Yeah.
it doesn't appear in every society. One of the theories of corruption is that it has emerged out of bureaucratization. So, bureaucracy, such as the British introduced to places like India and Bangladesh, um, those countries were they used bureaucracy and the slowness that is attached to change with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy slows down change. It's a very conservative force, and corruption was used. The term is often called speed money to speed up the system. So corruption and bureaucracy worked hand in hand together. Less reading, less thinking, less consuming of social media and news, and more action. And that taking action is not as hard as you think. Um, Make those steps in the direction of what you think you want to see changed, and you'll find that it's easier to do these things that you think you can't do than what you thought in the first place. So we're capable of more than what we think we are.
Invisible Experts Podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is it. This is our last episode of this season 2. And I'm honored having as a guest Olav Muurlink. Yeah, is that correct? Olav?
That's right. Yes,
Fantastic.
it's a very
Today is
global
a
playlist.
yeah. Today is a very nice conversation because Olaf is in Australia. I am here in Europe. So, we have like 8 hours difference, which is fine. Nothing is going to stop us. Hello, Olaf. How are you?
I'm very good. I have skipped breakfast because I got up a little bit late this morning, but I've had a coffee, so I'm ready to go.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks, man. Thanks, man. We really appreciate that you accept our invitation for this show. And first of all, if you don't mind, can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in working on social innovation?
Yeah, sure, Andres. I think I was born to be interested in change because my parents were immigrants to Australia, and at a time when non-English speaking immigrants were not very popular in Australia still. So much has changed during my lifetime in terms of the way we appreciate immigrants in Australia. But, these are interesting times we live in right now, where the whole question's starting to come back into the public discussion about immigration. But my dad was, because of that, he was a bit of an outsider, had a willingness to take unusual stands. And I can remember at a very early age, he was involved with protests against the Vietnam War. And a little bit later in life, as an engineer, he became very interested in the risks associated with nuclear power. And in particular, he said nuclear power was a great form of energy. But the real problem, and this was the key, was that nuclear power had to be run by humans. And humans were always the weak link when it came to safety in terms of any kind of systems. And really what my dad was saying, he was an engineer and I'm a social psychologist. Really what he was saying is that humans add an essential instability, unpredictability, bit of excitement to life, of course. Without humans, where would we be? But but at the same time, risk and unpredictability into all social systems. So I had a very, very unusual childhood, quite early on involved with both political discussion at the breakfast table, but also political action. So I can remember handing out how to vote or distributing how to vote cards during a critical election when I was only 7 years old. And a little later in life, I became involved when I was a teenager. I became involved quite actively in the anti-nuclear movement, and that activity really sparked in me a feeling that it wasn't good enough to sit around the breakfast table, as some of my family members like to do, and just complain and see issues as devastatingly oppressive, and the end of the world was coming. That kind of thinking never appealed to me. I always felt this is where I stood apart, I think, from my family. I always felt that it was not good enough to just sit and talk. You had to take some action. If you felt that there was a problem in the world, you needed to go out and do something about it. And so at a really quite early age, Andres, I decided that I wasn't just going to sit on the sidelines or in the football stands. I wanted to go out and play on the field of social change.
Wow, that's great. So, if I'm not mistaken, your family is from the Netherlands or not?
That's right. Yeah, Dutch and Dutch people are known as outspoken, and so I've never had a problem. I'm very shy because we left Brisbane. My dad was so concerned about, the coming nuclear holocaust that he shifted the whole family out of a very comfortable middle class lifestyle in Brisbane into almost instantly significant poverty. In a rural location where we were very poorly equipped to survive. We had a farm that wasn't very fruitful, a fruit and vegetable farm, and we suffered from hail and droughts, and we would have to work all year round as kids to just get the harvest in and keep the family going. So I was a very shy kid. So when eventually I did step out into the world, which was in my 20s, and step out into the world, I was extremely, I found it very difficult to engage with society because I had lack of practice in being in society. But one thing that always struck me very strangely was that when it came to speaking out on public or, doing a podcast or radio interviews or something, suddenly all the shyness would disappear and I was able to speak. And that was all those breakfast table conversations that I'd done since I was 7 years old came out, and I suddenly was very, very comfortable talking, polemic, if you like, being persuasive speaking, like public speaking came very naturally to me because of my strange background.
Wow, that's fascinating. So basically, your family, you could say was isolated in the
Very
rural
much.
areas.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you
Yeah.
think it
In
would be
fact,
like, yeah, do you think it would be this kind of like Captain Fantastic story?
it is really. It was a very unusual story. So from the age of 9, I didn't go to school. I did all my schooling in a very, very Australian way, which was called correspondence school. So you'd receive envelopes with your teaching material from the school in Brisbane, which handled this distance education, as we call it in Australia. And in fact, I even did a year of School of the Air where I would talk on a two-way radio with my schoolroom, which was 1,000 kilometres away or 2,000 kilometres away in Charleville. And so, I did all that schooling all the way through my first degree. I also did remotely, and it was again sent to me in packets, and then you fill in the assignments, send them back for marking. And so that's how I progressed until I was postgraduate, actually. So a very, very isolated existence with just my brother and sister as company of my own age, really, and my parents. And the world that I saw came through my parents' eyes to a significant degree, but also through watching documentaries on television. So it's not as if the world caught me totally by surprise when I stepped out into it because um, I had been a keen reader of news and a keen watcher of documentaries and news and public interest news over the 15 or so years that I spent in relative isolation.
Wow. So basically, you absorbed kind of like the world needs through TV and watching the news. And then I would say, like, that's why you're passionate about social innovation. Put yourself into action. Better to be a doer than a sayer, right?
Yeah, I guess we were never afraid. If you grow up in an immigrant family, and you can probably even tell my accent is not particularly Australian. And the reason it isn't particularly Australian is my accent was developed by ABC and BBC television. That's where I got my that's where I got my English accent from. I think I grew up as an infant. Probably my first language was Dutch, but I was trained in English by the television, you could say. And, I always dreamed of being able to communicate to the outside world. So I adopted an accent that mimicked the accent that I hear on high quality television, if you want to put that in quotation marks.
Wow. Like I would never think like maybe a Dutch family would face, you know, the hard, perhaps, issues of being a migrant because I don't know, I would say you guys are European. I don't know,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say so.
Well, it was very different. So my parents arrived in the late 50s in Australia. No, late 60s. No, late 50s. Yeah, that's right. And my dad was a master's trained engineer from Holland at a time when there was a great need for engineers in Australia. And yes, my mum and dad were white, but they had strong accents and not accents that were familiar to Australians. And so he was always given shitty jobs, junior jobs, and often his bosses, or almost always his bosses, were English. And so he had a fair bit of resentment towards people who spoke English as a first language because they always, regardless of their qualifications, got better jobs than him. And that was a common experience. Even when he eventually became an academic like myself, um, I remember him telling me that the students were so unused to the Dutch accent that they asked the head of school to change the lecturer because they couldn't understand him, which was my dad. And the head of school was a smart man. He said, just give him 2 or 3 weeks and come back in 2 or 3 weeks and let me know if you've still got a problem. And these people were so unused to, the students were so unused to an accent different to the English that they didn't know that the ears would get tuned to it. My dad spoke perfect English, but just with an accent. And they never came back. He remained their lecturer and he had a great experience actually as an academic. So yeah, Australia now is very multicultural. But back when I was very young, you would go to the fruit and vegetable shop and you might find pumpkins, carrots, potatoes, onions, apples and oranges and not much else, very, very straight English or European orientated food. But yogurt, you couldn't buy it. Yogurt, even you couldn't buy at the shop. It had to be bought from special places because it hadn't even made an appearance in the shops at that stage. So
Wow.
very, very different to now.
So when you
Very
guys moved to the rural area, this is something that you just bought that or you rented a property?
no, we bought a property. And we made every mistake that a human can make, like every mistake. I mean, nature is tough. In Australia, it's a hard, hard country. It's not soft English or European conditions. Every year there would be either late frost, early frost, hail, drought, flood. Like there would be a crisis every single year. And at first we didn't understand when we started growing fruit and vegetables and the hail came. We were delighted. It was like snow. And then when the hailstorm stopped, we realized we had no crops left. And that was the end of the year. You still had work the whole year pruning, pruning the trees, fertilizing the trees, cultivating the paddocks, doing all that work, and then one 10-minute hailstorm and it was all over. That was nature.
Wow, that's fascinating, man. And I agree. I mean, living in rural Australia is as hard as living perhaps in the Amazons, deep
Yeah.
down somewhere like this. I believe like a lot of animals. And how about health? In terms of healthcare, if you get sick, what would you do?
Well, you didn't get sick because we didn't have a great deal of contact with the world, so we didn't get a lot of germs and viruses, etc. We were quite fit, and we ate the food. The one good thing about living on a farm, or there were many, to be honest, don't get me wrong, there were many great things about living on a farm, but you certainly had fresh fruit and vegetables, fresh milk. We were largely self-sufficient in many ways, and but just to quickly say something that should be said is that I don't regret that experience, even though it left me in some ways with a great disadvantage. It also left me, like you sort of hinted earlier, with some superpowers, like the ability, because my whole education was self-directed. When I did eventually get to university, I had no idea that I was smart or stupid. I didn't know. I didn't have any comparison. In fact, because I was the youngest child and my brother and sister were older than me, I thought I was stupid. And at my first degree, I ended up getting so many A's for my work that I ended up winning the university medal, which was for the highest achieving student in the university. And I think that was because of that training in self-directed learning that I received. And then similarly on the farm, you have to become handy. Like I think I've got 10 thumbs by nature. I'm not a very manual person, but if you spend 10, 15 years on a farm, you have to become a manual person. So I'm not afraid of a hammer or a saw. Whereas most of my academic friends are completely impractical when it comes to practical things.
It's
Um,
crazy. I know. Look, to be honest, in my case, when COVID happened, I was useless. I didn't know anything basically. I was
mm,
feel like hopeless and useless, and I didn't know anything to do with anything, right? So I
mm.
bet you have this kind of like intelligence to survive in the
Yeah, that
world
was
if
funny.
something bad happens.
Yeah, it's true. And when COVID happened, of course, all my end of the world kind of thinking that was embedded in my brain came out, and I decided I'd leave Brisbane. So I was still working as an academic. I still am. But because everything went remote, I thought, let's get out of the city. That was my first instinct, Andres. Let's get out of the city. So I moved to the country during COVID, and that was, yeah, it felt very natural for me to deal with, have to get chickens again and start growing some vegetables and yeah, and getting away from humans. That was my first instinct, yes.
And also like for you, it was like normal because you didn't have this such a contact with others around
Yes.
yourself. Well, how
Yeah.
about animals? How did you guys deal with animals? Because they
Yeah,
could
look,
be huge.
it's an interesting one because I love animals, but farming and living in the country does make you realize things about where meat comes from and where milk comes from and things like that. I mean, I was the one in the family who was probably the most sensitive, you could say, to that. And so I've never been that comfortable with animals simply because, not because I'm afraid of them, but because I worry about them all the time. So I worry about chickens, I worry about dogs, I worry about cats. Are they bored? Are they not bored? Is the cow hungry or not hungry? I spent too much time worrying about other creatures, to be honest. So I didn't find the animal aspect very comfortable. But we had cows and we had chickens and everything that a normal farm has, a mixed farm has. We had that, and that form of farming, Andres, as of course almost disappeared in Australia in my
Oh,
lifetime. So that was just that kind of mixed small farm was common then, but now it's all mass agriculture in Australia, and very few small farmers exist anymore.
Wow.
So we were the last of that generation in some senses, but hopefully not the last that we'll ever see, because I do believe we need to bring small farms back. I think that that is a change that would make the world a better place.
Wow. Would you like, do you have children?
No, I don't. No.
But if you
Again,
had children, would you do the same? Like, would you go to the countryside and live as you
yeah,
did?
I think I would, Andres. Yeah, I think I would.
That's great.
Um, yeah, I
That's
think that it's a great education. It's a conversation I have with my brother and sister. How do they feel about how they, and there's mixed feelings. I'm probably the one that is most, I was the youngest, so I experienced the least of the normal world before I went to the country. They were older, so they'd had more normal teenage and pre-teenage experience than me. Um, but maybe I'm self-deceptive, which is interesting because that became my PhD topic, self-deception. Maybe I'm self-deceptive, but I can see so much that I gained period that I wouldn't. That if you asked me, would I do it another way? I couldn't, because I wouldn't be who I am, and I kind of like who I am now. Anyway, it took me a
definitely.
while.
That's great, man. Wow. So when do you actually decide, okay, you finish your first degree, right? By post, let's say,
Yes,
in
yes,
distance learning. And then when do you decide, okay, I have to go out, I want to go to the city, I want to make maybe
yeah.
my own way and see what happens. How do you decide that?
It's funny. To be honest, it's not that I ever wanted to go back to the city, etc. But remember what I said earlier, from a mid-teens period, I had this drive to, um, just let's use a cliche, save the world. I wanted to change the world, make a difference, and I wasn't going to do that sitting on the farm. So I was quite driven to leave the farm, not because I didn't like it, in fact, that not at all, but because I had a very strong sense that there was nothing to be done there to change the world. If I just stayed there on the farm, I wouldn't make any impact. And, in those, pre, I hadn't been tested in reality. Everything was going on in my head. And the reality of the world was out in the cities. And it was all theory that was in my head. Theory about how to change people, theory about how to improve things on the world. And I needed to carry that out in practice. So I eventually left the farm, not not for the final time. I left the farm at about 24, 25. And at that stage, I had a partner, and we stayed together for 17 years until she passed away from cancer. So I had a partner that made it a lot easier. She was from the outside world. And so she was, in a sense, my ambassador to the outside world. Um, I think I would have struggled if it hadn't have been for her, because I would have had to do it all on my own, get out of the farm. And I wasn't equipped for that. But with her to help me, I was able to get out into the world. So my first big step, Andres, was a very big step. I went to Scotland, and I I'd saved up enough money. I didn't know about scholarships in those days, so I saved up enough money to buy myself a master's degree, from St Andrews in Scotland. It was one of the top psychology universities in Europe, and I wanted to get qualified in psychology. So I did a master's in psychology at St Andrews, and came back to Australia with a little bit more confidence in myself, a little bit more self-awareness, and yeah, just feeling much more ready to take on, social innovation challenges, changing the world. I felt in a better position. I looked like a baby, though. I think, that was one problem. Because of my skin, which I got from my mum, I always looked way younger than I did. Even now, I get mistaken for someone in my 40s or 50s, but I'm almost 60. But then I looked like a teenager as like early, even in my early 30s, I looked like a teenager, which was very problematic. I would have paid for some wrinkles, a bit of grey hair at that stage.
Wow. Dude, it must have been the food, I suppose the
Yeah.
peace being in a
I don't know.
farm. Definitely, man.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you
Look, I
kind
was
of,
always
yeah, in a way. I think you
Australia's
just,
also,
yeah.
sorry, I was just going to say Australia's also very aggressive from the sun point of view. And my parents were very, very careful to keep us out of the sun. And that's a great benefit. Like the skin gets ruined in Australia very quickly by exposure to very aggressive sun. So we were good on skincare, you could say, Andres.
Wow. And also, like, I suppose you kind of like you were exposed to another type of stress, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it wasn't about, maybe the pace of the people and, the the violence, I don't know, the conflicts. So you were
Yeah.
in a way safe. When you got out from it and you arrived to Scotland, do you have something like you were really amazed in a good way? Something that you didn't expect? Because of course you see everything through TV,
Yeah.
but you
Yeah.
weren't that distance from reality. But one thing is to observe, as you said before, you are like kind of a player. So I suppose when you get there, you must have
Mm.
seen and have the ability to, perceive things that nobody else, surround you will have
I
the
can, I
ability to.
can I can remember one particular moment. So, when I went to Scotland, I got on a plane for the first time in my life. So that was my first experience with flying, and I thought it was fantastic. Actually, even though I knew it was bad for the environment, I thought the plane felt like a adventure ride for me. And eventually, I went through hopscotch through Hawaii and Denver on a cheap flight with my partner to London, and I arrived jet lagged and exhausted at one of my anti-nuclear contacts allowed me to stay at his place in the middle of London on my first night or two. And I can remember waking up in the middle of the night because my mental clock was completely wrong. And I remember I'm in London now. I'm in that place that I saw on the BBC all the time. And it was like a movie, that sense that you suddenly transplanted onto a movie set that you didn't really belong in. But overall, Andres, I was quite surprised that the world was roughly as I thought it would be because I expected it to be very different. I expected that I was cynical enough to think TV wasn't accurate. The documentaries weren't quite documentaries. So I was expecting the world to be somewhat different than what I'd seen on TV, but in fact it wasn't. It was it, it the TV did mirror life to a pretty good degree. I mean, I didn't watch soap operas and I didn't watch movies a great deal. I watched the news and documentaries and uh, you know, uh, there was no reality television at that stage. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have absorbed some reality television, but that didn't exist at that time. And so it gave me a pretty good facsimile of reality. I was surprised.
Wow, that's fantastic. But then you mentioned that you spent a lot of time in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Yeah, and that came roughly not much longer after this period. So when I came back from Scotland with my degree, I did some academic work, but mainly I did worked with my dad, who had given up on farming and started his own enterprise manufacturing products for the painting industry. And so I got involved with manufacturing and marketing of products, global marketing. So we exported paint rollers made out of Australian sheepskin to countries like Switzerland and England and Denmark, particularly Denmark and Greece. So my dad was very entrepreneurial, which is something that he passed on to me. He started a business and made it grow from a very small base and was quite successful at it. And I worked with him. Um, I I then also started my own business. Um, and it was initially a radio station. I bought a radio license, a small radio license, and started a radio station. And then shortly after that, I started a small newspaper because all the advertisers said, "Oh, Olaf, we like radio, but we like to see our advertisement in print, you know." So I said, "Oh, okay, I'll start a newspaper." And I did that. And both the radio wasn't successful, but the newspaper was very successful. And through that, um, through chance, I met this elderly gentleman who, a former small engine mechanic in the town of Warring. It was, in fact, my partner Susan who went and got a haircut one day by a lady who worked with this gentleman and said that he was building schools in Bangladesh. And that absolutely triggered me. I thought, in this small town of 10,000, there is an old man who has decided to change the world. And with no real background, again, someone who grew up in the country and much older than me. He was retired, and he was spending all his time and money building and running schools in Bangladesh. I think at that stage it was just one school, and I decided to help. And I think I saw this as an opportunity. Um, I think I saw this as an opportunity to um, do something the way I dreamt of doing it. Like I had this fantasy of changing the world. Here was an opportunity to carry the fantasy out into action. And so that's what I joined him and I became more and more involved. I eventually joined the management committee, then I became the chair of the management committee. And when in 2016, he passed away at the age of 96. And until the age of 94, he was still traveling to Bangladesh, building these schools. His name was Fred Hyde. And he fought during the war as a young man, and he continued to fight until he was 94 in the foreign fields, you could say. And now we have 40 schools there. I've taken over his role now. I haven't quite retired yet, but I've taken over his role in terms of I visit Bangladesh regularly now. I'm about to go there very shortly. And we have 40 schools and 18 kindergartens in southern Bangladesh, and it's quite a large operation now with around 10,000 children in full-time education. So yeah, I just by chance, I've ended up carrying out that fantasy of making some change in the world. Not as much as I wanted. I wanted to make a real difference. And when I look at the world today, I really worry that I haven't made anywhere near the difference I wanted to make. But reality is always a little smaller than fantasy, I think.
Sure. Wow, what an experience. So, do you think having that experience in Bangladesh perhaps, shaped your understanding of global challenges and local solutions?
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned before my PhD was about self-deception. And so I was always fascinated by the fact that as a child, I was always fascinated by the fact that adults could go around their lives as if they'd never been children. What I saw when I spoke with teenagers, I saw, idealism, energy, enthusiasm, which I saw was often absent in adults. And I thought, how do they transition from these idealistic young people into these boring older people? That's as a teenager, I saw that and I thought, what's happened to these humans? Where is the idealism gone? And so when I had to choose a PhD topic, I chose to try to investigate this. It proved to be a very difficult topic to investigate, and it ended up transforming into a PhD about attitude change, which is a much more common field of study in psychology. How do you change people's attitude? And can you change people's attitude? People's resistance to change. They are more than happy to change if they want to change. But if you try and push them to change, it's extremely difficult to achieve any significant nudging of their attitudes, even though we try through television advertisements and other means. We try to change people, but it's really tough. Um, and so when it came to doing the work in the field, in Bangladesh, um, I've again been taking some of that theory into action to see what I can do to achieve change in the field. Because where we operate, in some senses, is a century ago. This is an area where there are no paved roads. Most people still go on bicycle around their work or walk. There's no queue of vehicles at the schools in the morning with children being dropped off by their parents. The children have to trudge through mud for kilometers on their own. Sometimes as a 5-year-old, they have to trudge to school for kilometers through mud to get to the school. Um, we used to, when I started working in the field, I discovered that the exercise books were so small that they had to be careful with every letter or sentence that they write because there was not enough paper to write on. And even creativity that we take for granted in young kids here in the Western world, if you gave them some colored pencils and asked them to draw, they wouldn't really know how to draw. There was no natural drive towards creative thinking that we think of as being a natural, but it's really a function of the way we treat childhood in the Western world. So everything was different, Andres. Like, the language was different, the food was different, the temperature, the incredible hot, humid temperature of Bangladesh. But then these fundamental psychological characteristics, like people's willingness to speak out, willingness to be creative, that we take for granted in Australia, for example, they're not present there. So it was a very, very difficult and continues to be a very, very difficult, laboratory in which to try to gradually achieve what we want to achieve, which is that they have the ability to think their way out of the poverty that they find themselves in. It's not me that the white man is going to come in and save them. I just want to give them the tools so that they can save themselves. And that's what education hopefully can offer. But it's a hard slog. It's difficult. It's really difficult.
I mean, Bangladesh, I guess it's supposed a really hard society because it's very, how to put it? I mean, the inequality is huge, right? I mean,
It's probably
yeah.
inequality is probably similar to what it might be in the United States or something. I haven't actually
Mhm.
checked formally, but uh, yeah, inequality is huge. It's a very conservative society, but it's one of the insights you get. It's conservative for a reason. When you're so heavily populated and it's so hot, and everyone is living so close to each other and resources are only just enough to survive on, it's a miracle that there's not starvation every year. It's a miracle that there's not civil war in Bangladesh every year. But it's not. It's a peaceful society that holds on because it realizes its limitations. And so, you know, no wonder they don't want to rock the boat because the boat is so low in the water that if they rock it, they will all drown. And that people are aware of the precarious situation they're in. And, I think they respond very positively to that precarious situation by being generally quite careful, generally.
Yeah. Was it hard to adapt yourself to a new type of religion?
Sorry, say again, Andres?
That if it was hard for you to adapt to a new type of religion?
Not really, no. I'm obviously Australian, and my parents were were Catholic, but I grew up very much as an atheist, you know.
Yeah.
So for me, uh, I think religion is, of course, important in societies like Bangladesh, um, but I'm not convinced that it is the number one um, uh, issue or driver behind culture, or even driver behind change or lack of change or resistance to change. I don't think religion acts is not. I don't think religion is as powerful as we think it is when we think about it as a either a creator or an inhibitor of change. You know, I think there's other factors. The reality of the Bangladeshi situation, which is that it's a meter from sea level, that it is close enough to the tropics that it's incredibly hot, impossibly hot there most of the year. Um, these are the factors I think that the fact that the rivers, there are thousands of rivers, each one of them larger than the largest river in Australia, you know, that makes the world. This is what really drives Bangladeshi society. These fundamental characteristics, I think.
Wow. So I guess Bangladesh for you was a life-changing experience, right?
Yeah, and I tell you I've had a chat with a Bangladeshi colleague of mine who's about to do the opposite. She's about to leave Bangladesh. She's been working with me for a number of years, and she's about to leave Bangladesh and go to America to do a master's degree. So a little bit of a mirror of my life, you could say. She's got a
Hmm.
scholarship to go to a really good university. She's smarter than me. She got a scholarship. I didn't get one. I just paid, and she I said to her, she said, oh, she's really apprehensive now that the flight time is getting close. And I said, all you need to do is buy the ticket. Once you buy the ticket, human nature will kick in. You'll step into the airport lounge, you will step onto the plane, you'll step off the plane, you will step into America, you will step into an Uber, you will step into the hotel, and you'll step into that world. And people think that change, like if you want to be a social innovation warrior, that it requires some sort of magic, you know, but really all that it requires is that you take a step. Each step will lead to another step. And for me, I always was petrified of traveling to Bangladesh. When I first became aware of it, Bangladesh was always in the news for people drowning in ferry accidents. And I knew that to do this work, I would have to travel on a ferry through these giant rivers
Wow.
into this land that was barely a meter above sea level. And I was petrified of the whole experience. But in the end, it was never as bad as I feared. I thought I wouldn't be able to handle the poverty. I thought the poverty, I mentioned feeling sorry for chickens and cows. Imagine how you feel when you see humans in that kind of troubling situations. I thought I wouldn't be able to cope. So
Chil-
I thought I couldn't cope with any of this, you
yeah,
know.
children,
And
no, especially children.
children, yeah, children starving and, people dying and, just enormous poverty. And I thought I couldn't cope. And so for me, one of the biggest lessons about growing up, in fact, stepping out into society, stepping into Bangladesh was that just do it. I know it sounds like a Nike slogan, but, grab a ticket, go, and from then on, you will swim, you will survive.
Yeah,
You just keep stepping forward. And so eventually it all proved to be less hard than I thought it would be. Like I was able to cope better than I thought I would, even though I was not that well equipped to cope. From my childhood, I wasn't designed for the kind of work I was doing, but I still was able to cope. It shows that humans, for all their resistance to change, if change is forced upon them in this manner, they're able to cope. They're able to survive. They're able to do things much beyond what they thought they ever could. So in a sense, my story, if you think about my life, Andres, is kind of like a lesson in my life is a little bit of a lesson in that if you set your dreams quite early, and you just keep stepping forward, almost inevitably, exactly what you wanted will happen. Like I always dreamed of becoming a writer. Well, I never succeeded. But I became a journalist. So, and I became an academic. So, in a sense, I did succeed. I wanted to save the planet, and I never succeeded. But I did end up working in for almost 3 decades now in an international charity that changes people's lives. So, and it came almost naturally, just by taking little steps and just keep on stepping forward. So you can achieve your dreams. I know that sounds really corny, but you can achieve your dreams because probably the impediments you fear are not as great as you think they are.
Yeah. So we were talking previously to the podcast about corruption and its impact, right?
Yeah.
And I
Well,
guess throughout your conversation that this is one of the key topics that you would love to contribute and change it, right? And I
yeah,
agree with you, man. Corruption is, I don't know, it's a sort of a sickness that I don't know whether it's embedded in the human beings or we just learned throughout. I don't know. So corruption is
it's a funny
definitely,
one, isn't it?
yes, it's a huge issue in the
It's a
world.
huge issue, and I'm surprised that I've managed to talk about Bangladesh for 15 or 20 minutes without actually mentioning the word corruption, because corruption is of course one. It is actually one of the fundamental problems that Bangladesh faces. So on the Transparency Index, Bangladesh is in the bottom um, quartile for bad countries that have a major problem with corruption. But Bangladesh functions despite corruption, not because of it, but despite it. So in some cases, Bangladesh is an interesting case study of a country that is able to do surprisingly well despite corruption absolutely soaking its institutions. So to give you an example from my own personal experience with the charity was called Cooperation and Development, or Fred Hyde Schools. I should mention that. But is that we've had our own lawyers be corrupted, bribed to act against our interests. We've had judges that we've sat before be bribed to act against, to hide cases that were being taken against us, simply hide them, bury them, so that we were not aware that they were there, so we wouldn't even get to court to represent our interests. We've had teachers' jobs at our schools sold to people unbeknownst to us without us realizing it. We've had children charged for products that we thought we were giving away free, that kind of thing. Almost every action within that we encountered, we had to, it took us a while. And, one of the things that's marked the 12 years that I've now been operations director, you could say, in Bangladesh, or head of country, as we call it. The thing that's marked that period has been continual vigilance and continual action to try to reduce, if not eliminate, corruption from our organization. And, to go back to your question very, very briefly, Andres, yes, corruption, in some senses, I've come to the conclusion that it is the fundamental problem holding Bangladesh back, for a simple reason that corruption cuts across reward for effort or reward for merit. So the people who thrive in Bangladeshi society are not the best. The people who get the best degrees and the best jobs, etc., and they're not the best. They're the people who are the best at being corrupt.
Wow.
And so it's rewarding the wrong behaviors. And so, what does that tell children at our schools? What are the key skills you need to get ahead? It's not the skills they need for Bangladesh to truly thrive. It's the skills that are focused on yourself and your family's needs that you can achieve through corruption. And so
Wow.
that is the killer. That's the thing that is dampening any real progress in Bangladesh.
So, from the psychological point of view, because you understand about psychology, what would you say, corruption exists? What's wrong with us as people,
Mm.
that we get corrupted so easily?
I don't think corruption really is that natural.
Okay.
Um, yeah, because I do think that there's plenty of evidence of societies, including um, Indigenous societies in Australia, where corruption didn't simply appear. Now, if it was a natural instinct corruption, you would expect it to appear in every society, and
Yeah.
it doesn't appear in every society. One of the theories of corruption is that it has emerged out of bureaucratization. So, bureaucracy such as the British introduced um, to places like India and Bangladesh, um, those countries were they used bureaucracy and the slowness that is attached to change with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy slows down change. It's a very conservative force, and corruption was used. The term is often called speed money to speed
Yeah.
up the system. So corruption and bureaucracy worked hand in hand together. And you'll
Mm.
see that in a lot of British Empire countries and other empires that had strong bureaucracies, corruption appeared as a kind of counterforce to deal with the slowness brought about by corruption, brought about by bureaucracy, I should say. Yeah. So I don't think it's a natural force, um, but it's very common. And there's good reason to believe we can overcome it too, because if you look at countries like Singapore, which are now high performing countries with quite low corruption levels, well, they used to be less than a century ago. They used to be a low performing country with high levels of corruption. So it can be overcome. It can be overcome. There's
Yeah, I
hope.
think in Singapore there is even a death penalty or something.
Yeah. They got someone, I've not read the Singapore case. I'd love to do that if I had time, but it's one of the ones where I think that you could see a bit of a timeline of how it is possible to overcome it. Um, in terms of what I've done in Bangladesh, I've had to use it I've had to deal with corruption on a small organizational scale. We've got 180 staff there, and that's a big enough problem for me to handle, actually. That's a big enough problem.
Wow. So, from your perspective, how or no, what can both individuals and businesses do to reduce corruption and its impact?
I think in a business, it's probably a little bit easier because it is a choice. But I'll tell you a scary story of business and corruption, a personal story. So during one of my earlier adventures into entrepreneurship, I started a small neon light factory in China. I know you're not going to believe this, but it's true, Andres. I started a small neon light factory in southern China. And it grew quite rapidly, and I visited China quite regularly during that time. And China, of course, also suffers from corruption, quite
Mm.
bad corruption. And at one stage, I made it very clear as the boss and the owner of the company that I didn't want to have anything to do with corruption. 100% zero tolerance, et cetera, et cetera. And my manager there, who was disabled to the point that he was managing in a wheelchair. A really impressive guy, actually, with great social skills. He said to me, Olaf, we need to we need to bribe this particular government official who held a licensing authority in relation to our business. And I said, no, we will not do that. I absolutely refuse. He said, if you do not, and here's the killer, Andreas, if you do not bribe this official, you will be arrested for bribing this official.
Wow.
So there was no choice. Um, at a non-profit organizational level, we've had similar problems. So whenever we encounter the government, we face the threat of having to be corrupt. And again, we've got a zero corruption policy. So we do not pay bribes, but we suffer. As an organization, we suffer the consequences of refusing to pay bribes. So getting our budget approved, getting auditing done, getting licenses, every step becomes extremely difficult and requires patience and pressure. So we use political pressure, we use contacts to try to avoid having to pay, and successfully so. We've successfully managed to not pay bribes in recent years. But at an organizational level with our own staff, um, because the country is desperate and because of this culture of corruption, it's everywhere. You think of it like rust and humidity. You know, in Bangladesh, you have to fight rust all the time. You cannot just give up for a year or two and think rust will go away. It won't. No matter how much you paint the metal, rust will appear. And it's similar with corruption and staff. We've just got to continually be monitoring for it. And what we've done is we've set up an incredibly transparent infrastructure. So as the chair of the organization, as the head of the organization, all the information that I have is shared with all the other key people. So, you know, even when I've got systems in place to ensure that no one has to trust me. You know, trust is not required, and I don't want people to trust me. Trust shouldn't be required for any of the people in the organization, because when you've got this much corruption, it's dangerous just to rely on trust. So instead, we rely on complete transparency in the way we run the organization. Even donors are given access to information that normally you wouldn't want to share with donors. Bad news, you know, but we make a point of sharing everything, good news and bad news, with donors. When we're struggling with a court case, and everybody knows, you know. So we've used that as our technique to, and also the sharing of power, the overlapping of power. I mean, I might be the chair of the organization, but there's multiple people who have authority within the organization and multiple pathways. We use WhatsApp, Facebook, emails, Zoom to continually communicate between the managers of the organization to try to deal with these issues. You know, it's tiresome, and all this is waste, Andres. You know, it's when I'm focusing on corruption, I could be focusing on improving education. But instead, I'm focusing on these basic operational level, fighting that all the time, instead of thinking about innovation in education, which is where I'd love to put my passion instead, you know? So that is the cost of corruption, is a waste of time.
Yeah. And I think education, as you put it, is the key to
Absolutely.
in a way, to wash away this behavior towards, corruption, and, perhaps behave ethically and so on. So what do you think, or how can education and awareness could play a role in tackling, such problems as corruption, poverty, which sometimes is interconnected, right?
Yeah, look, I'm sometimes asked the question, why Bangladesh? Why education? Because remember, I started out as a nuclear power activist, and I could easily have ended up on animal rights or multiple different things that I'm passionate about, but I ended up. This is where I am. I cannot do everything, so I ended up doing education in Bangladesh. And why? Um, Look, it's partly because of that old man in Warwick, I mean, because he was there and because he needed help. So it's just by chance it ended up that way. But sometimes when I think back now to how I ended up here, I'm glad I ended up in education. I probably would have preferred to end up in South America rather than Bangladesh, or I would have preferred to end up in Africa rather than Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is so hot, and it's so, the food is so hot, the spices almost kill me, and that it is a difficult country for me as a white man to to actually tolerate, to be honest. I find when I'm there, I can't wait to step back on the plane again and leave. Um, but um, but education is so fundamental, as you say, Andres. Like it underpins everything. If you were, as a thought experiment, I often say to my colleagues, if you were to drop myself or um, one of my other colleagues who spends a lot of time in Bangladesh, Paddy O'Leary, he's a farmer like myself, a former farmer, but he has no formal education, but he has an Australian education up until high school. And that
Mhm.
Australian education up until high school is easily the equivalent of a PhD in Bangladesh. Like the quality of the education he received is so much better than the quality of the education. If you were to drop Paddy into Bola Island in Bangladesh with no cash, no resources, and black skin color so that he would look like the people there, and the ability to speak Bangla. But everything else inside his head, the education inside his head would remain the same. If you run that experiment, I guarantee you that Paddy would not remain in poverty for more than a year.
Wow.
His brain is so different, his knowledge, his education is so strong that he would work his way out of poverty in a year. So that's how fundamental, and I've got no doubt that that is a true, that's a mental experiment, but I've got no doubt that it's true. And this is why I'm so passionate about it. It's not simply a matter of me snapping my fingers. We've got the schools, we've got the teachers, but we are dealing with such an endemic cultural issue that our teachers were taught at schools like we teach. We have to break that cycle. We have to bring in that fresh energy
Yeah.
because these people are stuck on this island, and that island is an ecosystem where education has never been properly valued. And so we need to change that, and we're still fighting that fight. We're not there, Andres. We're not there. We're improving. Some of our students have gone on to do PhDs, so that's extraordinary from a mud
Yeah.
island.
Of
But
course.
so many of them could do better. In
Yeah.
fact, almost all of them, we could do better. And I know this passionately. We could do better, and that's what I want to do. I haven't succeeded yet, but that's what I want to do.
Mm. And also, like education doesn't have to be formal. I mean,
Not really. No, it
right?
doesn't have.
Yeah, it
No.
doesn't. I mean, it's just like in a way to learn from others through mentors
Yeah,
online, as you did
yeah,
the instant
yeah,
learning.
yeah.
Yeah, there
No,
is a
but
certain ways to do it though.
true, but I do feel for the children in this society because you look at the children, they're bubbling, energetic, bright-eyed. They're just like children all around the world. But once they reach the age of 20, a little bit like my nightmare scenario in Australia, it's a similar transition, but worse. When I look at Australians, I think by the time they're in the 20, all they're thinking about is getting a home and having children and just getting a job and going to Bali every year. That's their dream. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with the dream, but there is so much more to be done in life and than just that. These children in Bangladesh, it's even worse transition. They just get they get through school, they get married way too young, 15, 16, 17, having children, and there's they will never be able to break that cycle because corruption is all around them. Conservative lack of creativity is all around them. There's no easy escape. Educating themselves, sometimes a brilliant student will start to read. Absolutely brilliant student will escape. But the average student needs more help than just, they do need the formal structures to kickstart that creativity, kickstart the independent thinking that allows them to escape. But otherwise, they will never escape. And yeah, so education is escape. It was for me too, Andres, wasn't it? Like was my way out of
Yeah, yeah,
my
100%.
background.
But also it's interesting because I have the feeling that there is maybe this kind of like attitude towards homeschooling, distant learning, and truth be told, it's been proved that it's as good as, the orthodox one, right?
It can be. I mean, homeschooling, of course, is now a big global movement, partly because of COVID. But I guess the advantage that shouldn't be forgotten is my dad was a lecturer at a university, and my
Okay.
mum was a school teacher. Now, strangely enough, you'd think that that would mean my parents would be sitting at my table helping me with my school. Nothing could be further from the truth, Andres. My brother's a very senior veterinarian in Australia. And he also went on to do brilliantly at university. And my sister decided to stay on the farm, and that was her choice. But she also ended up studying as well. But all three of us received almost no help from our parents. And so the
Mm.
question is, did we really educate ourselves? And the answer is obviously not true. The answer is in the breakfast conversations, the breakfast table conversations. My parents actually passed on critical thinking, creativity, communication skills, and then they went off to work and left us study on our own. But they planted the seed in us, and we then grew on our own. But they certainly weren't there holding our hands as teachers, which they could have done. Now I worry. So can you expect, if you homeschool, um, can you expect that in every case? Probably not. So there are risks in homeschooling, that if you have the wrong kind of parents, it's a stupid thing to say, but certain parents will not have the capacity in the culture of their family to create education on their own.
No, 100%. I'm one of them, man. I wouldn't be able to teach to my kids because I don't have the skills, the patience. It's a tough one. I mean,
It's a tough one. But I think that the real lesson there is, the society or the culture in which a human being exists is it's there. That matrix that we're sitting in is it's there and is incredibly influential on our choices. We think we're human beings with free will and free choice, but in fact, we sit inside a social matrix that holds us somewhat in place. It's no surprise that I turned out just like my dad, you know. Even though my dad died many years ago, I've turned out just like him. And it's not because he wagged his finger and told me turn out like him, but I watched him, I watched what he did, and I slowly imitated that. And we all imitate what's around us. So as humans, we need to model what we want our children
mm,
to be like. We need to model that. We don't need to tell them that. Because if there's one lesson about social innovation that I try to pass on, and that relates to my own personal experience, it relates to my PhD, it relates to my work in Bangladesh, it is this: you cannot tell people to change. You cannot force change, but you can be the change. I know that, again, a bit of a cliche, but if you act in a particular way, and enough people act in that way, then the change will simply happen.
yeah, yeah, but it's true. I mean, you have to lead by example. You cannot really
Absolutely.
persuade anybody, not even children. I guess they have their own, genetic system, and then step by step they watching over, and then they copy it, right?
Yeah, cotton. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanna know a little bit more about these breakfast table talks that you had when you growing up. How old were you, or it just happened since you were little?
It would have been my earliest memories of, like, I guess 6 or 7.
Mhm.
I can still remember that the shape of the table was half a egg shape, it's like a oval shaped egg. In at this stage, I still lived in the city of Brisbane, which is where I work now,
Yeah.
as an academic. But my dad would be reading the paper or listening to the news, and he would raise a topic, and we would just talk about it and argue about it. But Dutch people all have loud voices, and so the noise at the table was very significant. It was generally my sister and brother and my dad who were dominating the conversation, and I, being the youngest, was sitting there listening and watching, and not passively though. As I said, I think one of the big things that happened to me as a teenager, sitting and listening to these breakfast conversations, was for a while I glorified it. And I thought, wow, how interesting. And I used to think things like, oh, I'll never be like that. I'll never be able to come up with great examples like my dad did, or arguments or thoughts or creative ideas like my dad did. And I just assumed it was all beyond me. But there was also a moment where I realized, you know what? This is very persuasive. The world is really in a bad state, as my dad used to say a million times. Yes, it is a very serious problem. Okay, enough talk now. What are we going to do about it? That was the step.
The open question, yeah.
Yeah, that was my big question. And so I was the one actually that kind of pushed the family to some degree into a greater degree of activism, because I looked around. You're talking about my future, my planet here, as if it's some sort of video game. I'm going to have to live in this. Let's go out and fix that. Let's just, with enough talking, you've convinced me there's a big problem. What are we going to do about it?
Wow, that's a great one. I think I'm going to start to practice these breakfast table talks. Maybe we would inspire our kids to, to be change makers or something. So I want to ask you, Olav, if you perhaps would like to share 3 recommendations for those who wants to contribute to society and to the world. What would they be?
It's yeah, it's it's easy enough to be prescriptive, and I'm sure that everybody has their own path, you know. I think that I touched on one of them before, though, is that if you do feel stressed about what's happening in the world today, and to be honest, I don't think any of the listeners wouldn't be feeling distressed about it. Like it's very distressing. I would definitely say less reading, less thinking, less consuming of social media and news, and more action. And that taking action is not as hard as you think. Make those steps in the direction of what you think you want to see changed, and you'll find that it's easier to do these things that you think you can't do than what you thought in the first place. So we're capable of more than what we think we are. It's difficult, Andrés, for me to be super optimistic though, and because the one thing that has changed in the last 8 years or so, or 10 years or so, is that I'm a scientist, so one of the great discoveries of my life was discovering the scientific method and understanding statistics. I know it sounds terribly boring, but the way humans are set up, we are basic scientists, we are basic statisticians, but we're not particularly good at either of those things. We are scientists, we are statisticians, even babies are. The way they encounter the world and think about it is quite scientific, but we make lots of mistakes as amateur scientists. So what I have started to see is that faith in science and faith in the truth is starting to fail. And, we've been going from the Renaissance to this point, centuries of reasonably good progress. And now we're starting to go backwards because we're losing faith in the one single thing that we all agree on, whether we're Muslims from Bangladesh or Christians from Australia. Secretly, we all believe in science. We all rely on science. And yet now we are starting to actively disbelieve in it.
Of course.
So that would be lesson number 2 is fight for the truth, and not the truth that you find through your own research on the dark holes of the internet, but actual understanding of raw data, statistics, becoming familiar with statistics so that you can start to see that some of the patterns that we think we see are not real.
Wow.
One of the lessons that I always tell my students now that I teach research is that it took us until the 20th century to discover that smoking was bad for us. Now, it's obvious to everyone now, but it took a set of scientists and statisticians to prove it. Humans just using their eyes and ears and their natural scientific thoughts were not able to establish that smoking was bad for you. It took proper scientific method to prove it. And it only took 2 years. After thousands of years of smoking, we finally discovered, with 2 years of statistics, that it was bad for human beings. So science is something that if it wasn't involved with education broadly, I would be passionately fighting for truth. And I guess the final thought is if you're looking for something to do and you want to make an impact on the world, education is a great place to start because, children, we need to open their eyes up to science, to the truth, to creativity, to imagination, exploration, and to trust things that they're not familiar with. Education is bringing ourselves closer to things we're not familiar with. People who are scared of Muslims have never been to a Muslim country, and realized, that some of my conspiracy theory friends are amazed that I'm not killed each time I go there. Well, far from it. I feel very safe in Bangladesh. The only non-Muslim in an entire island of Muslims, and I don't have any stress or strain about my safety. And the one final thing I would say, Andres, which is connected to education, is this. There is a profession just waiting for you out there that all of us should consider being involved with, other than education, and that is journalism. Journalism is under terrible threat.
Yes.
And journalism is under terrible attack. And like science, it's under attack. And like science, it needs to be defended because journalism is professional reporting of what's happening. And there's a lot of unprofessional journalism happening in the world today, full of people's opinions and thoughts. In fact, sometimes if you open up common websites or newspapers, you'll find mainly opinion. We don't need opinion. We need facts. We need to move forward with knowledge. And journalism is an incredibly powerful profession where you can change the world. I discovered that as a young journalist who started my own newspapers and radio stations. I think that that was one of the most powerful things I could have done. And I'm still a great believer in journalism, despite the attacks that it is under now.
Yeah. Wow. That's great, man. I think that was the best way to closure this episode. Thank you, Olaf, for giving up your time. We really appreciate this. We learned a lot through you. And let's see if people pick up at least one of these 5 recommendations.
Sounds great, Andreas. And to wrap it up nicely, I'm about to have my breakfast, so some conversations coming up.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Okay,
Yeah,
Olaf.
thanks.
That was great.
Appreciate it.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you, everybody. Goodbye.